Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's tale begins, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. There was a time when fear crept quietly into our district, not with sirens or headlines, but with whispers. It wasn't the kind of place where people expected something like that to happen. Our area wasn't crime-infested. In fact, crime almost never happened at all. It was the kind of district where people recognized each other at the store, where names overlapped through friends of friends, where if you didn't know someone directly, you knew them through 5 or 6 people. It felt contained, safe, predictable. That sense of safety is what made everything that followed so unsettling. It started slowly. At first, it was just rumors. Someone heard that a woman had been robbed late at night. Another person said their friend's sister had been approached on her way home. These stories floated around without details, without confirmation. In a place like ours, people don't immediately believe things like that. You assume it's exaggerated, or that there's more to the story. Then the details began to settle in. The man doing it was a heroin addict. That much became clear early on. He wasn't just mugging people for money in the usual way. He was targeting women, usually alone, usually at night or in quiet areas. And what made him different from any ordinary robber was how he threatened them. He carried needles, not clean ones, not hidden. He would hold them up and threaten to stick the women with them if they didn't give him everything they had. He told them the needles were infected, that they carried diseases, that even if he didn't kill them, he could ruin their lives in a moment. The threat wasn't just physical harm. It was long-term fear, the kind that stays with you long after the encounter is over. For the women he robbed, the money was nothing compared to that fear. They gave him whatever he asked for. Cash, wallets, phones, anything to make him leave without touching them. Many of them said afterward that the worst part wasn't even seeing the needle. It was imagining what would happen if he followed through. The sickness, the waiting, the uncertainty. The way your entire future could be altered by 1 second of contact. The attacks didn't follow a pattern anyone could track. He didn't strike on the same street twice in a row. He didn't have a clear time window. Sometimes it was late, sometimes earlier in the evening, sometimes weeks passed between incidents. Other times, 2 happened close together. It felt random, but in a way that suggested intention rather than chaos. Police were notified, of course. Reports were filed. Statements were taken. Patrols increased, at least for a while. But there was a problem almost immediately. No one could describe him. Not really. The women he attacked were terrified, and that fear erased details. Some remembered a voice. Others remembered his posture. A few thought he was tall. Others thought he wasn't. Clothing descriptions didn't line up. Faces were blurry in memory. Hair color was uncertain. Eye color unknown. Age guesses varied wildly. All the police could say with certainty was that he was a man. That was it. No composite sketch ever made sense. Nothing was clear enough to circulate. In a district where everyone knew everyone, no one recognized him. No one connected the attacks to a known local figure. No one said, "That sounds like so-and-so." It was as if he existed just outside the web of familiarity that held the community together. That made it worse. People started changing their routines. Women stopped walking alone at night. Friends walked each other home, even for short distances. Parents called to check in more often. People locked doors they hadn't locked before. The district didn't become loud or chaotic, but it became tense, quiet in a different way, watchful. Every shadow felt heavier. What unsettled people the most was that this wasn't happening in some distant, dangerous neighborhood. This was happening here, in a place that wasn't supposed to have faceless threats. The idea that someone could move through the district, commit repeated attacks, and leave without anyone ever really seeing him broke something in a people's sense of control. And then, just as slowly as it had begun, it started to fade. The attacks became less frequent. Weeks passed without incident. Then months. People didn't relax immediately. No one announced that it was over. The fear just loosened its grip little by little. Walking alone felt slightly less dangerous. The constant checking over shoulders eased. Conversations about the man with the needle became less common. Eventually, the attacks stopped entirely. No arrest was made, no suspect was named, no explanation was given. The man was never caught. That absence of closure is what lingers. Crimes usually end with something: an arrest, a trial, a news article, a rumor about what happened. In this case, there was nothing. He simply vanished from the story. Whether he overdosed, moved away, was imprisoned for something else, or is still alive somewhere, no one knows. The police never even got a full description of his appearance, just that he was or is a man. That fact still unsettles people when it comes up, because in a place where everyone is connected, where anonymity is rare, someone managed to remain completely unknown. He passed through lives briefly, violently, and then disappeared without leaving a trace strong enough to follow. Some people believe he died. They say addicts don't last forever, especially ones living that dangerously. Others believe he left the district once the risk became too high. A few believe he's still around, older now, quieter, just another face in the crowd. No one knows which explanation is right. What remains is the memory of how fragile safety really is, how quickly a place can change without actually changing at all. The streets are the same. The buildings are the same. The people are mostly the same. But underneath it, there's the knowledge that someone once walked those same paths, carrying a needle full of fear. And no one ever truly saw him. That's what makes the story stick. Not the violence itself, but the anonymity. The idea that someone can exist among familiar faces and still be invisible. That danger doesn't always come from outsiders. That sometimes it comes from someone who slips through the cracks so completely that even when it's gone, you're left wondering if it ever really left at all. My grandmother used to tell this story quietly, never with drama, never with raised emotion. It was always delivered in the same calm tone, as if distance alone could soften something that never really stopped hurting. The facts never changed, but the weight of them always lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. Her father used to play cards almost every day with her husband, his own son-in-law. It was routine, familiar, the kind of habit that becomes part of the rhythm of life. Same table, same deck of cards, same arguments that never really mattered. They had known each other for years, long enough that disagreements usually ended in laughter or silence, not anger. Nothing about that night was supposed to be different, but it was. That evening, the game went on as usual until the discussion turned heated. No one ever knew exactly what they were arguing about. My grandmother said it was probably something small, something pointless, the kind of thing people get stubborn about without realizing why. Voices were raised. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. Eventually, her husband pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked away from the table. He went home. He didn't storm off dramatically. He didn't threaten anything. He just left. He went back to the house he shared with my grandmother, settled in, and tried to let the argument die where it belonged. From everything she remembered, he was calm by the time he got home. Whatever had happened at the card table already felt finished to him. Not long after, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't loud. Just a knock, steady and deliberate. My grandmother and her husband went to answer it together. When they opened the door, her father was standing there. He was holding a rifle. There was no argument at the doorway. No shouting, no warning, no hesitation. In one clean movement, he raised the gun and fired. The bullet struck her husband directly in the head. He died instantly. There was no time to react, no chance to run, no chance for her to scream or understand what was happening. But my great-grandfather fired twice. The second shot hit my grandmother in the neck. The bullet tore through her flesh and missed her spinal column by the smallest margin. Doctors later said that if it had been even slightly off, she would have been paralyzed or killed on the spot. Instead, she collapsed, bleeding heavily, still conscious, still alive. Her father turned and left. Neighbors heard the shots and rushed over. Someone called for help. My grandmother was rushed to the hospital by her neighbor, who was also her husband's cousin. In a matter of minutes, her life had split into before and after. Her husband was dead. Her father had become her attacker. She was clinging to life with a wound that should have killed her. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly. She was listed as critical, but there was hope. The damage was severe, but survivable. They didn't know yet what her recovery would look like or how long it would take. All they knew was that she was alive. The cousin stayed. He stayed through the night, through the waiting, through the uncertainty. He was there when the doctors said she might survive. He was there when they said she would likely make a full recovery, even though it would take time. He didn't leave when things became quiet or uncomfortable. He was there when she woke up. She opened her eyes to a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Pain radiated through her neck, her body weak and heavy. Her husband was gone, though she didn't fully grasp that yet. Her father had shot her. The world she knew no longer existed. And sitting there, waiting, was the cousin who had brought her to the hospital. He was there often as she recovered. Day after day, he came to see her. He helped when she couldn't move easily. He listened when she cried, when she was angry, when she was silent. He didn't push her to talk about what had happened. He didn't try to explain it away. He was just there, steady and present in a time when nothing else felt solid. She wasn't able to attend her husband's funeral. While her family buried the man she had married, the man she had expected to grow old with, she lay in a hospital bed, healing from a wound that never should have existed. Grief came in fragments, incomplete and delayed. There was no closure, no goodbye, just absence. The cousin was there when she was finally released. When the doctors said she could go home, he was the one who took her. He helped her walk. He made sure she was settled. He stayed when the house felt too empty and too loud at the same time. He helped her learn how to live in a world where her husband was gone and her father was no longer someone she could ever trust again. Over time, something changed. Grief has a way of reshaping people. trauma binds in strange ways. Shared loss, shared survival, shared silence. The cousin, who had once been just family by marriage, became something more. Not quickly, not without pain, not without confusion or guilt or fear. Eventually, they married. They were married for almost 60 years. 60 years is a lifetime. A whole life built on top of a moment that should have ended everything. They shared decades together, raised a family, grew old side by side. To anyone looking in from the outside, it might have seemed like a strange story, even an unsettling one. But to my grandmother, it was simply the life that unfolded after the worst night of her life. My grandfather passed away last year. When he died, my grandmother grieved him deeply, just as she had grieved her first husband all those years ago. But this grief was different. This was the grief of losing someone who had walked with her through unimaginable pain and stayed. Someone who had been there when her world collapsed and helped her build a new one, piece by piece. What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the violence. It's the way life continued afterward. The way a man could kill his son-in-law in a moment of anger. The way a daughter could survive being shot by her own father. The way love could grow out of tragedy. Not as a replacement, but as something entirely new. There is no clean moral to it. No lesson that makes it easier to understand. It's messy and human and deeply uncomfortable. It shows how close love and violence can sit beside each other, how quickly familiar faces can become dangerous, and how survival doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it just looks like continuing to breathe and letting time do what it will. My grandmother carried that night with her for the rest of her life. She didn't talk about it often, but it shaped everything that came after. It was always there, under the surface, a reminder of how fragile everything is and how unpredictable people can be. And yet her story also shows something else, that even after something unthinkable, life can still stretch forward, not cleanly, not easily, but forward all the same. That, more than anything, is what stays with me. My mom used to leave for work incredibly early, around 4 or 5 in the morning. It was still completely dark out at that hour, the kind of dark where everything feels muted and unreal, like the world hasn't fully woken up yet. We lived out in the country, right beside a highway, on a stretch of road that was long, straight, and deceptively calm. Hardly any traffic that early. No streetlights, just darkness, trees, and the occasional sound of a car rushing past. About half a mile from our house, there was a small apartment building, 5 units total, sitting on the corner of a side road that connected directly to the highway. Right before that turn, along our road, there were 5 mailboxes lined up in a neat row. Everyone who lived there knew them well. They were just part of the landscape, something you passed every day without thinking twice. That morning, my mom got up like she always did. Same routine, same quiet house, same drive. She didn't notice anything unusual until she got close to the turn onto the side road. That's when she saw the car. It had crashed straight into the row of mailboxes. The car was sitting there at an odd angle, clearly not supposed to be there, metal twisted and crumpled around where the mailboxes had been. What struck her immediately was how still it looked. There were no headlights on, no interior lights, no hazard lights blinking. Nothing that suggested someone was inside or that the crash had just happened. Her first thought was that it must have happened earlier in the night. She assumed emergency services had already been there, that the driver had been taken away, and that the car simply hadn't been removed yet. It didn't look like an active scene. There were no flashing lights, no people around, no movement at all. just a wreck sitting in the dark. So she didn't stop. She kept driving and went to work. At the time, it felt like a completely reasonable decision. It was early, it looked old, and in the dark, with no signs of activity, there was nothing to suggest otherwise. She went through her shift like any other day, not thinking much about the wreck beyond a passing curiosity. Later that day, she found out the truth. The crash hadn't happened hours earlier. It had happened maybe an hour before she passed by. The driver was still in the car when she drove past. And the reason there were no lights on was because the person was already dead. What makes it so much worse is how they died. The car had hit the row of mailboxes with such force that the driver had been decapitated. The mailboxes, something so ordinary and harmless looking, had essentially acted like a blade. It was an instant, brutal death. When my mom learned that, it shook her deeply. She realized how close she had come to stumbling onto that scene firsthand. If she had stopped to check it out, like some people might have, she would have walked up to the car in the dark at 4 or 5 in the morning and discovered exactly what had happened. Alone, in silence, in the middle of nowhere. I can't even imagine what that would have been like. The smell, the darkness, the shock of realizing someone had just died in such a violent way, and that they were still there, so recently gone that the night hadn't even finished yet. That kind of image would never leave you. It would follow you forever. Instead, she drove on, unaware of how close she was to something truly horrific. That's the part that gets to me the most. How easily life brushes up against unimaginable violence without us even knowing it. One small decision, one assumption, one moment of not stopping, and the experience becomes something you hear about later instead of something you live through directly. Every time I think about it, I imagine how different her memory of that morning would be if she had pulled over. How different she might be. How some things you can never unsee once you see them. It also makes me think about how dangerous even familiar places can be. A straight road you've driven 1,000 times. A row of mailboxes you pass every day. Early morning quiet that feels safe simply because it's quiet. All of it can turn deadly in an instant. The idea that she passed a car with a dead person inside and didn't know it until later is unsettling on its own. But the idea that she could have been the first to discover the body in that state at that hour is something else entirely. Sometimes the scariest part of a story isn't what happened, it's what almost happened, and how close you came to being the one who found it. I heard this story secondhand, from a friend of a friend, but it has always stuck with me because of how close it came to ending very differently. It's one of those stories that makes your stomach drop, not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened and how easily it could have gone another way. This was about his mom back in the 1970s. It was a different time. People hitchhiked openly then. It wasn't seen as reckless the way it is now, especially among young people. Gas was expensive, public transportation wasn't always reliable, and there was this general belief that most people were decent. Dangerous people existed, sure, but they were thought of as rare, almost mythical. Not something you expected to run into on an ordinary night. His mom was young, and she had a close friend she spent a lot of time with. They lived in the Seattle area, and like many people their age, they hitchhiked when they needed to get around. It wasn't unusual. They had done it before. They had rules like only getting into cars together, trusting their instincts, and not going too far out of their way. One night, they were hitchhiking together after being out late. I don't know exactly where they were going or where they had come from, but it was dark and the roads were quieter. Eventually, a man pulled over and offered them a ride. At first glance, he seemed normal. That's the detail that always gets me. There was nothing obviously wrong with him. He didn't look wild or threatening. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't aggressive. He spoke calmly. He looked like the kind of guy you wouldn't think twice about sitting next to on a bus or seeing in a grocery store. They got into the car. For the first part of the ride, everything seemed fine. Small talk, casual conversation, the kind of polite, surface-level exchanges people have with strangers. But at some point, one of the girls, his mom or her friend, started to feel uneasy. It wasn't something she could point to clearly. He hadn't said anything overtly threatening. He hadn't touched them. He hadn't raised his voice. It was just a feeling, a subtle shift. Something in his tone, something in the way he looked at them. Something that made the air in the car feel heavier. That kind of instinct is hard to explain, especially to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's not panic. It's not fear in the dramatic sense. It's more like your body quietly telling you that something isn't right, even if your brain hasn't caught up yet. She didn't want to make a scene. Instead, she gave her friend a look, a small signal, something only the two of them would notice. Her friend picked up on it immediately. That alone probably saved their lives. They trusted each other enough to act without needing a long discussion. They told the driver that they had changed their minds. They said something simple and reasonable, that actually they could just be dropped off at a gas station coming up ahead. No drama, no accusation, just a change of plans. That's when the man's behavior changed. Not drastically, but enough to confirm that their instincts were right. He didn't agree easily. Instead of saying sure and slowing down, he started insisting that it wasn't a good idea. He told them they shouldn't be out so late alone. He said it wasn't safe. He said they could call their parents from his place. He said they were almost there anyway. Those words, especially in hindsight, are chilling. On the surface, they sound caring, protective even. But when you put them in context, when you realize these were two young women asking to be let out of a car and a man refusing to do so, they become something else entirely. He was trying to keep control of the situation. He kept driving. The girls became more afraid, but they stayed outwardly calm. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They just kept repeating that they wanted to get out at the gas station. The tension in the car must have been unbearable. Every second that passed mattered. Then they reached a red light. As soon as the car stopped, they didn't hesitate. They threw the doors open and ran. They didn't look back. They didn't worry about being polite. They didn't stop to explain. They ran as fast as they could, adrenaline kicking in, fear finally breaking through in full force. The man jumped out of the car and tried to run after them. That part is important too. He didn't just sit there shocked or confused. He chased them, at least for a short distance. That alone tells you everything you need to know about his intentions. Someone who genuinely wanted to help wouldn't react that way. For whatever reason, he gave up. Maybe there were people nearby. Maybe the traffic light changed. Maybe he realized he had lost the advantage of control. Whatever the reason, he stopped chasing them, got back in his car, and drove away. The girls were shaken, but they were alive. They found a safe place. They eventually got home. They talked about what happened. Probably over and over, replaying every moment, every decision, every feeling. At the time, they knew they had narrowly escaped something bad, but they didn't know just how bad. Life went on. Years passed. Then one day they saw his face on the news. It wasn't just similar. It wasn't a vague resemblance. It was him, the same man, the same face, the same eyes, the same voice they remembered from that car. It was Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. A man who targeted young women, a man who appeared charming, normal, trustworthy, a man who used exactly the kind of manipulation they had experienced. A man who convinced victims to go with him by pretending to be concerned, helpful, safe. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The insistence, the refusal to let them out, the "you shouldn't be out so late alone," the offer to take them to his place. It was his pattern. Realizing that fact must have been horrifying in a way that's hard to describe. It's one thing to escape a dangerous situation. It's another to later learn that the danger had a name, a history, and a long list of victims who hadn't been as lucky. They weren't just almost hurt. They were almost added to a list of murdered women. They were almost faces on a timeline. Almost names in a documentary. Almost another what if people would talk about decades later. The only reason they weren't is because one of them trusted a bad feeling, and the other listened without questioning it. That's what makes this story so powerful. There was no weapon visible, no obvious threat, no dramatic moment where he revealed his true self. Just a quiet sense of wrongness, a refusal to be ignored, and a split-second decision to run when the opportunity appeared. It also highlights something deeply unsettling about how predators operate. They don't always look like monsters. They don't always act violently right away. They often rely on social pressure, politeness, and fear of being rude. They rely on the idea that people, especially women, will hesitate to make a scene. In this case, that hesitation could have been fatal. The fact that this happened in the Seattle area during the same period Bundy was active adds another layer of dread. This wasn't an isolated coincidence. This was happening all around quietly, while people went about their lives, hitchhiking, trusting strangers, believing that the worst things happened somewhere else. Stories like this are terrifying not because they involve famous killers, but because they show how thin the line is between safety and disaster. One different decision, one ignored instinct, one friend not paying attention to a look or a tone, and the outcome could have been irreversible. When people talk about true crime now, it often feels distant or clinical. Names, dates, numbers, documentaries. But stories like this remind you that behind every case are moments like this, where everything hangs on something as small as a red light or a shared glance between friends. That man went on to kill many women. These two weren't among them. Not because he chose not to, but because they chose to escape. And that knowledge, that their survival came down to instinct, timing, and courage in a single moment, is what makes this story stay with people long after they hear it. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen to that quiet voice in your head that says something isn't right, even when you can't explain why. Sometimes that voice is the only thing standing between you and a future that never gets the chance to happen. When I was a kid, I went to a summer camp that felt like a second home. During those long, hot months when school was out and days seemed endless, it wasn't anything fancy. Just fields, crafts, games, buses that picked us up and dropped us off every day, and counselors who felt impossibly grown up at the time. When you're a kid, the adults in your world fall into clear categories. Parents, teachers, camp counselors. They all feel permanent, like fixtures that will always be there. One of my counselors stood out to me even then. She wasn't loud or flashy, but she was kind, patient, and attentive in a way that made kids feel safe. She remembered names. She listened when someone talked. She laughed easily. She also took the same bus home that many of us did after camp ended for the day, so she felt even more familiar, like part of our everyday routine instead of someone who existed only in a camp setting. For a while, everything was normal. Then one day, she just didn't show up. At first, no one thought much of it. Counselors were people too. They got sick. They took days off. Maybe she had something else going on. Kids don't immediately assume something is wrong. We just notice the absence in a vague way. Someone else filled in for her that day. Camp went on. But days passed. She didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. That's when it started to feel strange, even to us. Kids notice patterns. When someone who's part of your daily rhythm disappears completely, it creates a gap you can feel, even if you don't know how to explain it yet. I remember asking where she was. I remember other kids asking too. The answers we got were vague. She wasn't coming back. That was all we were told. Eventually, I asked my mom. I don't remember exactly how I phrased it. Probably something simple, the way kids do. Why isn't my counselor coming anymore? I wasn't expecting anything dramatic. I assumed she had moved or quit or gotten another job. Something ordinary. My mom didn't answer right away. That pause is something I remember clearly now, even if I didn't fully understand it then. Adults pause like that when they're deciding how much of the truth a child can handle, when they're weighing honesty against protection. Finally, she told me. She explained that after camp one day, my counselor had taken the bus home like she always did. The bus dropped her off in front of her house, just like it always had. Nothing seemed out of place from the outside. It was daytime. A normal neighborhood, quiet, safe. The kind of place where people leave bikes in their yards and don't double-check their locks because nothing bad ever seems to happen there. When she went to her front door, it was unlocked. That alone was strange, but not alarming enough to prepare her for what she was about to walk into. People forget to lock doors sometimes. You notice it, shrug, and move on. She opened the door and stepped inside her home, expecting everything to be exactly as she had left it that morning. Instead, she found that someone had broken in, and her mother was dead. Not from an accident, not from natural causes. She had been brutally murdered inside her own home. The details were not shared with us as kids, and even now I don't know all of them. What mattered was the fact itself. A violent death. In a place that was supposed to be safe. In a house that had likely felt secure and ordinary until that moment. My counselor had walked into the aftermath of something unimaginable. She never came back to camp. Of course she didn't. Her entire life had been shattered in one afternoon. Camp, buses, routines, and kids who depended on her for games and guidance suddenly didn't matter anymore. Grief replaced everything else. For me, and for many people in our town, the shock went deeper than just the sadness of what happened to her family. We lived in a well-off suburban town, the kind of place people describe as safe. The kind of place where crime feels distant, like something that happens somewhere else, to other people, in other neighborhoods. Violence like that didn't fit our idea of where we lived. It wasn't supposed to happen there. That was the first time I remember realizing, even as a child, that bad things don't check zip codes before they happen. That being in a nice area doesn't create some invisible shield against tragedy. Someone had walked into a quiet suburban home and committed a brutal act, and no amount of lawns, schools, or property values had stopped it. As a kid, I didn't fully understand the weight of it. I understood that something very bad had happened. I understood that someone I liked would never be coming back. But the deeper implications took years to settle in. At the time, it just felt unsettling, like the world had cracked open slightly and shown something it usually hid. I remember riding the bus after that and looking at houses differently. They all looked normal from the outside, just doors, windows, porches. But now I knew that behind any one of them, something terrible could happen without warning. That realization stayed with me longer than the details of the crime itself. I also remember thinking about my counselor, about her getting off the bus, probably tired from a day of taking care of kids, expecting to go home and relax, about the moment she noticed the door was unlocked, about that split second before she understood that something was wrong, that moment before her life changed forever. That image is hard to shake, even now. What struck me later as I got older was how quietly the world moves on after something like that. Camp continued. Another counselor filled her spot. Kids kept playing games. Parents kept working. Life adjusted around the absence, even though for one person, everything had stopped. That contrast feels cruel. But it's also real. Tragedy is deeply personal. But the world rarely pauses for long. It keeps going, leaving the people directly affected to carry the weight in ways no one else can fully see. In our town, people talked about it for a while. Parents whispered, adults became more cautious. Doors were locked more often. For a time, there was a sense of shared unease, a recognition that something unthinkable had happened close to home. But eventually, as always, time softened the edges. New things replaced old fears. Kids grew up. New stories took over. I never forgot it, though. It stayed with me because it was my first real exposure to violent loss, not through news or stories, but through someone I knew, someone who had been part of my daily life. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't distant. It was personal enough to leave a mark. Even now, when I think about safety, about how we assume certain places are immune to horror, that memory comes back. It reminds me how fragile that assumption is, how quickly normal can turn into something unbearable, how someone can leave for work or school or camp in the morning and come home to a reality that no one should ever have to face. I also think about how young she must have been, how unfair it was that she had to carry that loss so early in life. Losing a parent violently changes a person forever. And she didn't just lose her mom. She lost her sense of safety, her sense of home, her sense of the future she probably imagined. As a child, I didn't know what to say or how to feel beyond fear and confusion. As an adult, I feel a deep sadness for her, even though I never saw her again and don't know what became of her life afterward. I hope she found some measure of peace. I hope she was supported. I hope she was able to rebuild something out of the wreckage. But the story remains one of those quiet horrors that surface unexpectedly in memory. Not loud, not sensational, just deeply unsettling. It taught me, earlier than most, that violence isn't always announced, that it doesn't always happen in dark alleys or distant places. Sometimes it happens on an ordinary afternoon behind an unlocked door in a neighborhood everyone thought was safe. And sometimes the first sign of it for a child is simply noticing that a kind counselor never came back. I was about 8 years old when this happened. And even now, it's one of those memories that feels strange and unreal when I think back on it. I was at my grandma's house, playing outside with my cousins the way we always did. There wasn't much to do back there, so we made our own fun, wandering around the yard, looking behind sheds, poking through old things that had been left there for years. That was how we found the doll. It was lying behind my grandma's house, half hidden, like someone had thrown it there a long time ago and forgotten about it. It wasn't a normal doll. It was big, really big, about 3 feet tall, almost the size of a small child. It had a dirty dress on, once probably white, but now stained and gray from being outside so long. Its hair was messy and stiff, and its face looked old, not broken, just wrong somehow. At that age, though, we didn't think too deeply about it. Kids don't always see danger the way adults do. We thought it was creepy, sure, but also kind of funny. Something weird to play with. We dragged it over to the swing set in the yard and sat it on one of the swings. We started pushing it back and forth. At first, everything felt normal. The doll just sat there, swinging the way anything would when you push it. We laughed, joked about how creepy it looked, and kept going. The sun was out, birds were making noise, and it felt like just another afternoon at Grandma's. Then it happened. As the swing moved, the doll's head turned. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just slightly, like it was slowly looking to the side. One of us noticed it and froze, then pointed it out to the rest of us. We all stared at it, our laughter dying instantly. Before any of us could say anything, its eyes blinked. I can still remember the exact moment my stomach dropped. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't shadows or light or the swing moving. The eyes opened and closed, clear as day. The doll was doing something it absolutely should not have been able to do. We screamed. All of us ran back into the house as fast as we could, slamming the door behind us. None of us wanted to go anywhere near that swing again. We stayed inside for hours, peeking through windows, trying to see if the doll was still there. It was, still sitting on the swing, gently moving in the breeze like nothing had happened. Eventually, my cousin, who was about 14 at the time, decided to deal with it. He was older, braver, or at least better at pretending not to be scared. He went outside alone, grabbed the doll, and threw it over the fence into the next yard. The house next door was abandoned. No one lived there. The yard was overgrown, the windows dark. It felt like the perfect place to get rid of something you didn't want near you anymore. He came back inside and told us it was gone. We felt relieved, like the problem had been solved. The next morning, we went outside. The doll was back on the swing. None of us said anything at first. We just stared at it, the same dirty dress, the same stiff posture, sitting exactly where we had left it the day before. There was no explanation, no footprints, no signs that someone had picked it up and moved it back. It was just there, like it had never left. That was when real fear set in. My cousin didn't argue this time. He went out again, grabbed the doll, and threw it over the fence as hard as he could, farther into the abandoned yard. We didn't watch. We didn't want to see it again. After that, it was gone. We never saw it again. Not on the swing. Not behind the house. Not anywhere in the yard. It didn't come back a second time. No one ever talked about finding it later. It was just gone. Even now, years later, I still think about it. About how real it felt. About how all of us saw the same thing. About how it came back after being thrown away once and then disappeared completely after the second time. I don't know if it was some kind of mechanical doll or if our minds filled in gaps we didn't understand as kids. But I do know this. That fear was real. And to this day, whenever I see an old doll, especially one that looks like it doesn't belong, I feel that same tightness in my chest. Because some things, once you see them move when they shouldn't, never really leave you. When I was 13 years old, I went on a school trip to Amsterdam with a group of friends. At that age, everything feels bigger than it really is. You're old enough to feel independent, but still young enough to be scared easily, especially when you're far from home. For most of us, it was our first time traveling outside the UK without our families, and that alone made the whole experience feel intense and unreal. The trip itself was long and exhausting. We traveled by coach, and everyone already knew the plan for the return journey. The ride back to the UK was going to take around 17 hours. Because of that, a lot of us had the same idea. We planned to pull an all-nighter on our last night so we could sleep most of the way home. It sounded clever at the time. The kind of idea 13-year-olds think is brilliant without fully understanding how tired they'll actually be. The hotel we stayed in wasn't in the center of Amsterdam. It was about a half-hour drive outside the city. It wasn't fancy, but it wasn't terrible either. Just one of those plain hotels designed for school trips and tour groups. Long hallways, identical doors. That slightly stale smell that hotels sometimes have. Nothing about it seemed dangerous during the day. Our room was in an unlucky spot. It was right next to the main hotel entrance. At the time, that didn't seem like a big deal. We actually thought it might be convenient. Easy to get in and out, easy to find, close to where teachers and staff pass through. None of us thought about what that would mean late at night, when the building went quiet and the entrance became a place strangers could pass through. That night, we stayed up like we planned, talking, laughing quietly, sitting on our beds, trying not to get caught by teachers doing room checks. The lights were mostly off, just a lamp or the glow from a phone screen. Outside it was dark and silent in that unfamiliar way that makes everything feel more exposed. The first couple of hours were fine. We were tired but still excited. Everything felt normal. We talked about the trip, joked around, complained about how long the coach ride would be. Time moved slowly, but nothing felt wrong yet. Then, about 3 hours in, it started. At first, it was so subtle that none of us were sure we'd actually heard anything. A faint sound near the door, a soft click, then another. We all froze at the same time, looking at each other in silence. When you're that age, your imagination jumps ahead quickly, but you still try to tell yourself you're being stupid. Then it happened again. A clearer sound this time, metal against metal. Someone touching the lock. The realization hit us all at once. Someone was trying to open our door, not knocking, not calling out, not checking the room number and walking away. They were trying to force the lock. We could hear it clearly now. The sound of someone jiggling it, scraping something against it, testing it again and again. Our laughter stopped instantly. No one spoke. Every one of us climbed onto our beds without even thinking about it, pulling our legs up close to our bodies. It was like some instinct took over, telling us to make ourselves smaller, quieter, less visible. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I remember thinking that I had never been that scared in my life before, and not knowing what to do with that feeling. The sounds didn't stop. They went on and on. The lock rattled. There were pauses, then more attempts. Whoever it was didn't seem rushed. That was the worst part. It didn't feel like someone accidentally trying the wrong door and realizing their mistake. It felt deliberate, like they were determined to get in. Minutes passed, or at least it felt like minutes. When you're scared like that, time stretches and warps. What might have been 5 minutes felt like half an hour. Every small sound in the hallway made us flinch. Footsteps in the distance, the hum of the building. Even our own breathing felt too loud. None of us screamed. None of us ran to the door. None of us tried to call for help. Looking back, that part scares me almost as much as the lock itself. We were so frozen with fear that doing nothing felt safer than doing something. We were kids, alone in a foreign country, with no real understanding of how to handle a situation like that. Our brains just shut down and waited for it to end. The lock rattled again, then again. I remember staring at the door, convinced it was going to open any second. I imagined the handle turning, the door swinging inward, someone stepping into the room. My mind filled in details I didn't want to think about. I didn't know who was on the other side, and that unknown felt unbearable. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. There was no final click, no footsteps we could clearly hear moving away. Just silence. We didn't move. We sat there on our beds, staring at the door, listening as hard as we could. Our bodies were tense, ready to react if the sound started again. Seconds passed, then minutes. Nothing happened. Eventually, one of us whispered something, barely louder than a breath, just asking if the others were okay. That broke the spell enough for us to breathe again, but none of us felt safe. We didn't sleep. Not really. We stayed awake until morning, sitting upright, watching the door, jumping at every noise. When daylight finally came and teachers started moving around the hallway, the fear slowly loosened its grip, but it didn't disappear completely. We told ourselves that maybe it was a drunk guest, maybe someone confused about their room, maybe hotel staff checking something and being clumsy. We tried to explain it away because the alternative was too frightening to accept. But deep down, none of those explanations fully fit. No one ever came to check on us. No one apologized. No one explained what had happened. As far as we know, no other room experienced the same thing that night. That made it feel even more personal, even more targeted, even if it probably wasn't. The next day, we were exhausted. We got on the coach for the long trip back to the UK, just like we planned. Most people slept. I did too, eventually. But even while sleeping, my body felt tense, like it hadn't fully let go of the fear yet. Looking back now, as an adult, what scares me most is how vulnerable we were. We were 13, in a foreign country, in a hotel room next to a public entrance, with no real plan for what to do if something went wrong. We trusted that adults had everything under control, that places like hotels were automatically safe. That night showed me how fragile that sense of safety really is. Nothing actually happened to us in the end. The door didn't open. No one came inside. But the fear was real. The feeling of being hunted or tested or targeted, even if it was only in our minds, left a mark. It taught me how quickly a normal situation can turn into something terrifying, and how helpless you can feel when you don't know what's happening or who is on the other side of a locked door. Even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. About the sound of that lock rattling. About how quiet we were. About how young we were. It's still the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. Not because of what happened, but because of what could have happened and how little control we had in that moment. Some fears fade with time. That one never fully did. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. Arthur Shawcross is one of those names that never really leaves you once it enters your life, especially when it enters it the way it did for me. Not through a documentary or a true crime book, but through proximity, through people I knew, through ordinary connections that suddenly became tangled with something violent and unreal. He killed 12 people. That number alone is hard to hold in your head, but numbers are deceptive. They flatten things. They make them abstract. What makes this story heavy is not the number, but the way those deaths brushed up against my real life, against classrooms and workplaces and conversations that had nothing to do with crime, until suddenly they did. Shawcross first murdered 2 children in Watertown in 1972. They were just kids. That part is often mentioned briefly, then moved past, as if it's a prologue rather than a horror in its own right. He was caught, convicted, and later released, a decision that would come back to haunt an entire region. Years later, after his release, he went on to kill 10 sex workers in Rochester, New York. Those are the facts most people know. What most people don't know is what it's like to realize that some of the names in those lists are people you once shared space with, even briefly. That they were not just victims in a headline, but classmates, co-workers, siblings, friends. I went to school with Anna Steffen, who at the time was Anna Daly. We were just kids then, living ordinary lives, worrying about ordinary things. School felt like a sealed world back then, like something that existed apart from the dangers adults talked about in vague terms. Anna was just another student, a real person, not a future victim, not a name that would later be spoken with horror attached to it. Years later, I would learn what Shawcross did to her, details so disturbing they still don't sit right in my mind. It wasn't just murder, it was desecration, cannibalism, a level of violence that goes beyond killing and enters a territory that feels almost impossible to reconcile with the idea of a human being committing it. Knowing that someone you once went to school with met that kind of end changes the way you look at the past. It reframes memories. You find yourself thinking about small moments, meaningless at the time, passing someone in a hallway, sitting in the same room, sharing the same air. You don't remember anything specific, and that's almost worse, because it reminds you how normal everything seemed. Another victim whose life brushed against mine was Darlene Trippi. I didn't know her well. I met her once, just once, but I worked with her brother-in-law. She was part of his life, part of his family. When something like that happens, it doesn't stay contained to the person who was killed. It ripples outward, touching everyone connected to them in ways that never fully heal. Working alongside someone who lost a family member to a serial killer is its own kind of education. You see grief that doesn't have neat edges. You see anger that never really settles. There's no closure in the way people like to talk about it. There's just learning how to live with the absence and the knowledge of how it happened. What made all of this even stranger was another connection, one that felt almost surreal in its irony. Shawcross's attorney was David Moranti. That name came up in my life in a completely different context. Moranti was my friend's attorney years later, when my friend got arrested with 20,000 hits of LSD. That's not a small amount. It was serious. The kind of arrest that on the surface looks like it's going to end someone's future. Moranti got him off. He managed to have the evidence suppressed, and because of that, My friend walked free. Watching that unfold gave me a front row seat to how powerful good legal defense can be. How much hinges on procedure, on technicalities, on how evidence is gathered and presented. In that case, the system worked in my friend's favor. It did not work out that way for Shawcross, and that contrast has stayed with me. The same attorney who successfully dismantled a drug case also represented one of the most notorious killers in New York State history. It's unsettling to realize how close those worlds can be, how the same courtroom strategies, the same legal mind, can be applied to cases that feel morally incomparable. When Shawcross was finally caught for the Rochester murders, there was no escaping the weight of what he had done. The evidence was overwhelming. The patterns were clear. The cruelty was undeniable. Whatever failures had allowed him to walk free earlier did not save him this time. Still, the damage was already done. 12 people were dead. 2 children whose lives barely had a chance to begin. 10 women whose lives had already been shaped by hardship and vulnerability, and who were failed not just by one man, but by systems that didn't protect them when they were most at risk. Knowing victims personally removes any illusion that these stories are distant or contained. It breaks the barrier between true crime as entertainment and violence as something that invades real communities. It makes you uncomfortable with how casually these cases are sometimes discussed, how easily they become trivia or content. When I hear people talk about Shawcross now, they often focus on his psychology, his childhood, his pathology. They talk about him like a case study. And while understanding how someone becomes capable of that level of violence matters, it can also feel like the victims fade into the background when the killer becomes the main subject. For me, they never fade. Anna is not just a victim Shawcross cannibalized. She was a person I went to school with. Darlene is not just a name on a list. She was someone I met, someone whose family I worked alongside. These were not abstractions. They were people whose absence left real holes in real lives. The Watertown children, even though I didn't know them, carry their own weight in this story too. Their murders were an early warning that was ignored, a signal that was misread or minimized. When Shawcross was released, the risk wasn't theoretical. It was proven. And the cost of that decision was paid years later by people who had nothing to do with the original crime. That's one of the hardest truths to sit with. The idea that systems designed to balance justice and rehabilitation can fail so catastrophically that the consequences spill forward in time, destroying lives that could have been saved. There's also something deeply unsettling about the way these stories intersect with ordinary life. I didn't grow up in a crime drama. I grew up going to school, going to work, having friends, making mistakes, living normally. And yet, threaded through that normalcy were connections to one of the most disturbing crime sprees in the state. It makes you realize how thin the line really is between the everyday world and the worst things humans are capable of. How violence doesn't always announce itself with sirens and warnings. Sometimes it's already woven into the fabric of a community before anyone knows to look for it. Even now, years later, I think about how many moments could have gone differently. How many decisions along the way might have prevented what happened. Better supervision. Different parole conditions. More attention paid to patterns of violence. More value placed on the lives of marginalized people. And I think about how strange it is that I can say, truthfully, that I knew 2 of Shawcross's victims and his attorney. That sentence still feels unreal when I write it out. It feels like something that should belong to a movie plot, not to an ordinary person's life, but it's real. And that reality is what makes these stories so difficult to sit with. They don't stay in the past. They don't stay in court records or documentaries. They linger in memory, in relationships, in the way you understand the world afterward. It didn't turn out well for Shawcross. He died in prison, where many people feel he belonged all along. But not turning out well for him doesn't undo anything. It doesn't restore the lives he took or the futures that vanished with them. It doesn't heal the families who were left behind, or the communities that still carry the weight of what happened. What it does leave behind is a reminder of how important accountability is, how dangerous complacency can be, and how easily the consequences of one failure can multiply beyond anything anyone intended. For me, this story will never just be about a serial killer. It's about classmates who never got to grow older, about co-workers carrying grief quietly, about a legal system that can be brilliant in one case and devastatingly insufficient in another, about how violence doesn't stay neatly contained in history books, but reaches outward, touching people who never asked to be part of it. And it's about how sometimes the most disturbing part of these stories isn't what the killer did, but how close it all was to ordinary life. The first time I heard the name Sherry Martin, it didn't come to me as a news headline or a true crime podcast title. It came to me quietly, almost casually, in the middle of a family conversation. One of those moments where someone mentions a name and then pauses, as if deciding whether or not to keep going. When I asked who she was, the room went a little still. "She used to babysit your dad," someone said. That alone was enough to make the story feel closer than it ever should have. Not distant, not historical, not abstract. This wasn't a stranger whose face you'd only see in a grainy photograph. This was someone who had once sat on the same floor as my father when he was a child, who had watched him, fed him, probably laughed with him. Someone who had been trusted. Sherry Martin was young, still a teenager. She worked at a donut shop, the kind of job you take when you're just starting out, when you need money but don't yet understand how dangerous the world can be. She worked late shifts, cleaning up after closing, wiping counters, counting registers, doing the things that seem harmless until they aren't. One night, after work, she was taken. The people who took her weren't strangers who jumped out of the dark. That's one of the details that makes the story so much harder to stomach. They were people she knew from work, a family, faces she recognized, people she had likely spoken to before, smiled at, worked alongside. There was familiarity there, and familiarity breeds trust even when it shouldn't. They offered her a ride. It's such a small thing, that detail. A ride home late at night. Something that happens every day. Something people accept without thinking. Especially when it's offered by someone who feels safe. She got into the car believing she was going home. She never did. What happened after that is difficult to talk about even now. She was held against her will. She was repeatedly assaulted. The details aren't important in a graphic sense, and they don't need to be described to understand the horror of it. What matters is the duration, the fact that it wasn't quick, that it wasn't over in a moment, that she lived through hours, maybe days of fear, pain, and disbelief, trapped with people who had decided her life didn't matter. Eventually, they killed her. Not in a moment of rage, not accidentally. They made a decision. They ended her life and then tried to erase her existence by dumping her body in the desert. The desert is vast, unforgiving and silent. It swallows things whole. Heat, sun, time, and exposure did what they do best. By the time she was found, her body barely resembled anything human. That detail is often mentioned in accounts of her case, but it's never said lightly. It's said with a kind of stunned disbelief, like even the people who found her couldn't quite process what they were seeing. Exposure stripped away not just physical features, but identity. She had been reduced to something unrecognizable, as if the world itself had tried to finish the job of making her disappear. And yet, she was still Sherry. She was still a girl who worked at a donut shop, still someone's daughter, still someone who babysat a little boy who would grow up to be my father. That connection is what makes the story linger in a way that's hard to explain. It collapses time. It takes something horrific and places it right inside your family history. Suddenly, this isn't just a tragedy you read about. It's something that brushed against your own life before you were even born. I try to imagine her the way my dad might have known her. Alive, ordinary, probably tired from work. Probably talking about small things like plans for the weekend or complaints about customers. Not someone defined by what would happen to her, but someone defined by who she was before that night. That's the version that feels hardest to hold on to, because it's the version that gets erased first when a story like this is told. Victims become endings instead of beginnings. They become cautionary tales instead of people. What makes the Sherry Martin story especially disturbing isn't just the violence, as awful as it was, it's the betrayal. The fact that the danger didn't come from a dark alley or a masked stranger. It came from people who worked beside her. A family who present themselves as normal enough that no alarm bells went off. Evil didn't announce itself. It offered a ride home. The desert plays a strange role in stories like this. It's often framed as empty, but it's anything but. It's a place where secrets are buried, where bodies are hidden, where time and nature conspire to erase evidence. Dumping her there wasn't random. It was intentional. It was meant to make sure she would never be found, or if she was, that she would never truly be recognized. But she was found. Not in time to save her, but in time to say that something terrible had been done, that a life had been taken, that someone mattered enough to be searched for. That doesn't undo anything, but it does push back, just slightly, against the idea that she could be completely erased. Learning this story as someone connected to it by a thin but real thread changes how it settles in your mind. You start thinking about proximity, about how close danger can be without you realizing it, about how many people you pass every day whose lives intersect with yours in small ways, without either of you knowing what's ahead. My father doesn't remember her clearly. He was too young. Just vague impressions, a babysitter, a presence, someone who belonged to a time before memory really locks in. And yet she's part of his story, whether he remembers her or not. She was there. She existed in his world for a brief moment. That's what feels so unfair about it all. She wasn't supposed to be remembered this way. She wasn't supposed to become a story people tell in hushed tones. She was supposed to grow up, to leave that job, to have her own life stretch out in front of her the way it does for people who make it home at the end of the night. Instead, her name is attached forever to something horrific. When people talk about cases like hers, they often ask how something like that could happen, how no one noticed, how no one stopped it. The truth is uncomfortable. It happened because people trusted the wrong people, because predators don't always look like monsters, because systems fail, because luck runs out. and because sometimes someone just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, surrounded by people who have already decided to do something unforgivable. What stays with me most isn't the violence itself, as awful as it was. It's the ordinariness that surrounds it. The donut shop, the late shift, the offer of a ride, the desert that people drive past without thinking about what might be hidden just beyond the road. It makes you think about how many stories like this exist, tied quietly to families who don't talk about them much. How many names are remembered, not because of who the person was, but because of how they died. How many connections we have to tragedies we'll never fully understand. Sherry Martin isn't just a victim in a crime story to me. She's someone who existed close enough to my family that her absence echoes backward through time. Someone whose life ended violently, but whose presence still lingers in the spaces between stories, in the pauses people make before deciding whether to say her name out loud. There's no comfort in this story. No lesson that neatly wraps it up. Just the reminder that the past is closer than we think, and that sometimes the most terrifying stories aren't the ones that happen far away, but the ones that happen just close enough to touch us, even decades later. I was working in a lumber mill at the time, trying to save up as much money as I could before leaving for college. It wasn't a job I planned to stay in long, just something practical, physical, and exhausting that paid better than most temporary work. The days were long, the shifts loud, and everything about the place felt heavy. Heavy machines, heavy logs, heavy air thick with dust and the smell of raw wood. The mill was enormous. Even after weeks there, I still felt small inside it. Logs the size of cars were dragged in, lifted, rotated, and torn apart by machines that never seemed to rest. Everything moved with force and purpose. You learned quickly to respect the equipment because it didn't forgive mistakes. It didn't slow down for human error. If you weren't paying attention, it could take fingers, limbs, or worse. One of the biggest machines in the mill was designed to rip bark off massive logs before they were cut further down the line. It was loud even by mill standards, a constant grinding roar that vibrated through the floor. Thick logs were fed into it, and within seconds they'd come out stripped and raw, bark shredded and flung away like nothing. Watching it work was hypnotic in a terrifying way. It made you aware, very clearly, of how fragile a human body really is. During lunch break one day, a few of my coworkers started talking about that machine. Mill workers have a habit of telling stories like that. Not joking, not dramatic, just a matter of fact. Stories about accidents, close calls, people who used to work here. You learn pretty quickly that when someone says that phrase, it usually means something went wrong. One of the older guys mentioned that the bark stripping machine had jammed years ago, long before I ever started working there. Everyone at the table went quiet in that way people do when a story is about to turn dark. No one interrupted him. Apparently, when the machine jammed, production stopped completely. Logs backed up. Everything ground to a halt. The foreman at the time was under pressure to get things moving again as fast as possible. Downtime cost money, and money mattered more than caution back then. Instead of shutting the machine down properly and following safety procedures, the foreman ordered one of the workers to climb inside the machine to see what was causing the malfunction. The man hesitated. Everyone hesitates when they're told to step into something like that. You don't need training to know it's wrong. You can feel it in your gut, but hierarchy is a powerful thing, especially in places like that. The foreman was in charge. Saying no wasn't easy, and safety culture wasn't what it is now. The power was never fully turned off. That detail was emphasized when the story was told every time. The machine wasn't locked out. It wasn't secured. It was just quiet, temporarily stopped, like a sleeping animal that could wake up at any moment. The man climbed inside. No one knows exactly what he was looking at or what he was thinking in those moments. Maybe he was focused on the jammed log. Maybe he was trying to work quickly so he could get out. Maybe he trusted that the machine wouldn't start while he was inside it. Then it did. Without warning, the machine came back to life. It didn't start slowly. It didn't give him time to react. It did exactly what it was built to do. Massive rollers engaged, blades and crushing mechanisms activated. The machine grabbed him the same way it grabbed the logs. The story was told without embellishment, and that made it worse. He didn't die cleanly. He wasn't killed instantly. The machine smashed him into what one co-worker described as a bloody pulp. That phrase stuck with me because it was said so casually, like it was the only accurate way to describe what was left. There was nothing recognizable afterward. No body to recover, no form to cover with a sheet, just fragments, pieces of clothing caught in the machinery, crushed bits of bone mixed with bark and wood fibers, blood everywhere it could reach, smeared into places no one could easily get to. By the time the machine was finally shut down, there was nothing to save. The mill went quiet after that, not in reality, but in memory. That accident changed things. New rules were written, procedures were enforced. Safety became a word that was said out loud instead of implied. But it came too late for that man. What haunted me the most wasn't just the way he died. It was what happened next. The day after the accident, another worker was sent inside that same machine to clean it. Not a specialist, not a hazmat team, just a colleague. Someone who probably knew the man who had died. Someone who had likely eaten lunch with him, joked with him, worked alongside him. He was sent in to clean out what was left. I remember sitting there during that lunch break, feeling sick, imagining what that must have been like. Crawling into the same metal chamber, seeing the stains, finding scraps of fabric. Maybe recognizing a boot or a sleeve or something small that made it impossible to pretend it was just debris. There's something deeply disturbing about the idea of being asked to erase the physical evidence of a person's existence like that. To wipe them away so production can resume, so the machine can go back to doing what it does, as if it hadn't just ended a life in the most violent way imaginable. After I heard that story, I couldn't look at the machine the same way again. Every time I walked past it, I imagined the space inside. I imagined how easy it would be to make a mistake, how fast everything would happen if something went wrong. The noise didn't just sound loud anymore. It sounded hungry, indifferent, like the machine didn't care what it was fed. I started noticing how often safety was treated as an inconvenience, how people took shortcuts, how foremen pushed for speed, how tired workers made careless decisions because they were exhausted or rushed or just wanted the shift to end. That story stayed with me for the rest of the time I worked there. It changed the way I moved around the mill. I double-checked things. I hesitated where others didn't. I refused to do certain tasks if something felt off, even if it made me look slow or overly cautious. I didn't care. I kept picturing that man stepping into the machine because someone above him told him to. I also couldn't stop thinking about how quietly those stories were told. No outrage, no dramatic pauses, Just facts passed around during lunch like a warning disguised as small talk. It made me realize how normalized death and injury can become in places where danger is routine. How easily a workplace absorbs tragedy and keeps going. The mill didn't shut down forever. It didn't become a memorial. Logs kept coming in. Bark kept getting stripped. New workers were hired. Most of them never heard the story unless someone decided to tell it. I left for college not long after. I never forgot that machine. Even now, years later, the image still comes back sometimes. Not graphic, not vivid in detail, but heavy. The idea of a man reduced to fragments because someone didn't turn off the power. The idea of another man being sent in the next day to clean what remained. It taught me something I didn't expect to learn from a summer job. That danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly behind routine, waiting for one careless decision. And sometimes the scariest part isn't the accident itself, but how easily the world moves on afterward. She bought the house with excitement, the kind that comes with starting a new chapter. It was in our town, close enough to family, close enough to schools, close enough to everything that made life feel manageable. From the outside, the place looked normal, comfortable. Nothing about it suggested danger or tragedy. If anything, it felt like the kind of house people settled into for years. The kind where kids grew up and memories stacked on the top of each other until the walls felt warm with them. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. She couldn't explain it, and that was the part that bothered her the most. There was no obvious reason, no logical trigger. Nothing bad had happened yet. Still, she carried this persistent, intrusive thought that one of her children was going to die in a fire. Not that there would be a fire, but specifically that a child would die in one. The thought didn't arrive dramatically. It didn't come with panic or images. It just settled into her mind like a certainty that didn't belong there. She tried to ignore it. Parents have strange fears sometimes. You hear stories, you read headlines. Your brain fills in gaps when you love someone too much. That's what she told herself. She reminded herself that the wiring was fine, the smoke detectors worked, the house had passed inspection. There was no reason to believe something like that would happen. So she pushed the thought aside and focused on settling in. But the feeling didn't go away. Instead, it started layering itself onto other things. Not long after moving in, she began seeing someone in the house. It was always the same place, the second-floor window. She would be outside, sometimes in the yard, sometimes pulling into the driveway, and she'd catch a glimpse of a figure standing there. A woman, native, still, watching, not waving, not moving, just present. Every time she looked again, the window would be empty. At first, she told herself it was just reflections, shadows, light playing tricks through glass. Old houses do that. Trees cast strange shapes. Curtains shift. Your eyes fill in details that aren't really there. She wanted to believe that. She needed to believe it. But the sightings continued. It wasn't constant, which somehow made it worse. There was no pattern she could track. She would go days without seeing anything, then suddenly, there it was again. The same woman, the same window, the same stillness, always on the second floor. Never anywhere else in the house. Then there was the smell. Smoke. Not thick, not choking, but unmistakable. The faint, sharp scent of something burned. It would drift through the house without warning. She would stop what she was doing and sniff the air, her heart immediately racing. She checked the stove, the outlets, the kids' rooms, the basement. Every time she found nothing. No fire, no smoke source, nothing burning. The smell would fade as quietly as it arrived. This happened more than once. Enough times that she stopped brushing it off as coincidence. Enough times that it began feeding into that original fear she couldn't shake. Fire, smoke, children. The pieces were starting to align in ways she didn't want to acknowledge. Eventually, she mentioned it to one of the local women in town. The town had its share of people who had lived there forever. People whose families had been there long before records were neat and streets had names. The woman listened carefully as she described the feelings, the figure in the window, the smell of smoke. She didn't interrupt. She didn't laugh. She didn't look surprised. She simply nodded. Then she told her something that made the hair on her arms stand up. She said the spirits like her. That's why they keep visiting her home. She said it calmly, like it was common knowledge. Like it was an explanation that required no further detail. She didn't say it as a warning. She said it almost as reassurance, as if being noticed by something unseen was a compliment rather than a threat. That didn't make it better. If anything, it made it worse. From that point on, the house felt different. Every creak at night sounded louder. Every shadow felt heavier. She found herself standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up toward that second floor, half expecting to see the woman again. She slept lightly. She checked on her kids constantly, sometimes waking them just to make sure they were breathing. The feeling of dread never peaked. It never exploded into panic. It just stayed, low, constant. A background hum of unease that never fully shut off. Then the fire happened. It was one of the kids' rooms. The television caught fire. It wasn't dramatic in the way fires often are in movies. There was no explosion, no roaring flames consuming the room instantly. It started small, electrical, the kind of fire that could have gone unnoticed for just a little too long. Smoke filled the room before anyone realized what was happening. But this time, she smelled it immediately. She reacted fast. Faster than she knew she was capable of. She got everyone out. She called for help. The fire was contained. The damage was real but manageable. And most importantly, no one was hurt. The kids were alive. That should have been the end of it. A close call, a lesson, a story to tell later about how lucky they were. That's how most people would have framed it. She couldn't. Because the fire hadn't come out of nowhere. It had come exactly where she feared it would. In a child's room. After months of smelling smoke that wasn't there. After months of seeing a woman watching from above. After months of carrying a thought she never asked for. The relief of no one being hurt was overshadowed by something darker. A sense that this wasn't random, that this was a warning rather than an accident. That whatever had been circling the edges of her life had finally made itself known. She decided to move out. Not slowly, not after years of consideration. She made the decision quickly and stuck to it. People questioned her. The house could be repaired, insurance would cover it. Fires happen. She didn't argue with them. She didn't try to convince anyone else. She just knew she couldn't stay. Living there no longer felt like a risk she was willing to take. The house didn't feel neutral anymore. It felt occupied in a way that had nothing to do with furniture or people. Leaving felt like survival, not fear. Years passed. Life moved on. The house remained. Other people lived there, new families, new routines, new assumptions that nothing bad would happen because nothing bad had happened to them yet. The story of the fire became just another piece of local history, mentioned occasionally, but never dwelled on. Then the house burned down. This time, it wasn't contained. This time, it wasn't a small electrical fire caught early. It was total. The residents didn't make it out. People died in that fire. The news shook the town. Tragedies always do, especially when they feel preventable, especially when they happen in places that once felt safe. In the aftermath, stories resurfaced. People talked. Old conversations were remembered. Pieces of history that had been ignored came back into focus. That's when the truth about the land came out. The house had been built on an old native burial ground. Not rumored, not speculated, documented. Burial grounds that had been disrupted long ago, cleared and built over without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without respect. The kind of thing that happens more often than people like to admit. Progress layered over bones, silence layered over history. When she learned that, everything fell into place in a way that made her feel sick. The woman in the window, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something knew her, noticed her, the smell of smoke before any fire ever started, the certainty, uninvited and unexplained, that fire and children were tied to that house. It didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like she had been warned, not threatened, not attacked, warned. The local woman's words echoed differently in hindsight. The spirits like her. That's why they keep visiting her home. Maybe it wasn't about liking at all. Maybe it was about recognition, about choosing someone sensitive enough to notice, someone who would listen when something felt wrong. She left when she was supposed to. The others didn't. That's the part that stays with people when they hear this story. Not just the tragedy, but the timing, the near miss, the way one family escaped and another didn't. It raises uncomfortable questions about intuition, about whether some places carry intentions with them, about whether warnings exist, and if they do, how many people miss them because they don't come with clear instructions. She still talks about that house sometimes, not obsessively, not with fear, more with a quiet seriousness. She trusts her instincts now in a way she didn't before. When something feels wrong without reason, she listens. She doesn't wait for proof. She doesn't wait for permission. She believes that if she hadn't moved, her story would have ended differently. Whether the woman in the window was a spirit, a memory, or her own mind translating something older than language, she doesn't know. She doesn't claim to understand it fully. She just knows what she felt, what she saw, and what happened after. And she knows this. Some places remember what happened there, even when people don't. And sometimes they make sure you remember too. My mother's cousin is a farmer, and this story has been passed around our family for as long as I can remember. It isn't told loudly or dramatically. It's usually spoken in a lower voice, the kind people use when they're not trying to scare anyone, but also not trying to joke. The kind of tone that says this really happened, and we don't understand it. When he was a child, he got lost in the woods. This wasn't a small patch of trees behind a house or a place people casually wandered through. These were real woods, thick, wide, and easy to disappear in, especially for a child. Back then, there weren't phones, GPS, or quick ways to call for help. If you went missing, people had to search on foot. They had to guess where you might have gone. No one knows exactly how he got lost. Some say he wandered off while helping with farm work. Others say he followed an animal. Some think he just got curious and walked farther than he should have. Whatever the reason, at some point, he realized he didn't know where he was anymore. The paths looked the same. The trees closed in around him. Every direction felt wrong. He was missing for 3 days. 3 full days. People searched for him. Family members, neighbors, anyone who could help. They called his name, walked through the woods, checked nearby areas. But the forest didn't give him back. Every night that passed made the fear worse. A child alone in the woods isn't just lost. He's exposed to weather, to animals, to hunger, to panic, to things adults don't like to talk about. By the second day, hope and fear were tangled together. By the third day, people were preparing themselves for the possibility that he might not come back at all. That third night was a full moon. The sky was bright in that unnatural way only a full moon can create. The kind of light that turns familiar places strange, casting sharp shadows and making everything feel exposed and unreal at the same time. People still remember that detail clearly because it lines up too perfectly with what happened next. On the third night, under the full moon, he came back. He didn't come back with a smile. He didn't come back crying in relief. He didn't run into anyone's arms. He just appeared. Some say he walked out of the woods slowly. Others say he stood at the edge of the trees for a moment before anyone noticed him. What everyone agrees on is that something was wrong immediately. He wasn't just tired or hungry. He looked different. His eyes were wide but not focused. He flinched at sounds. He didn't respond properly when people spoke to him. When his family tried to ask him what happened, where he had been, what he had seen, he didn't answer in a normal way. Sometimes he didn't answer at all. Sometimes he said things that didn't make sense. It was like he had been through something his mind couldn't process. He was paranoid. He seemed constantly on edge, like he was waiting for something to happen again. Loud noises made him jump. Sudden movements made him freeze. At times, he would just stare at nothing, his body tense, as if he was reliving something over and over in his head. People assumed he had been traumatized. That explanation made sense, and in many ways it still does. A child alone in the woods for 3 days would absolutely experience trauma, hunger, fear, isolation, the constant sense of being hunted by the unknown. Even if nothing supernatural or unusual happened, the experience alone could break something inside a young mind. But there were details that unsettled people. He refused to talk about the woods. Not just reluctance, not embarrassment, complete refusal. When asked what happened, he would shut down, go silent, or become visibly distressed. It wasn't the behavior of a child who didn't want to remember. It was the behavior of someone who was terrified of remembering. That night, after he returned, he didn't sleep. No one did, really. The family kept watching him, afraid to leave him alone, afraid he might wander off again. He sat quietly for long periods, sometimes rocking slightly, sometimes staring into space. He didn't ask for food right away. He didn't ask for water. When he did eat, it was small amounts, almost mechanically. Then came the next night. This is the part of the story that still makes people uncomfortable, no matter how many times they've heard it. The very next night, after he returned, he went into the room where the chickens were kept. On farms, that kind of room is usually simple. Wood, wire, the smell of animals, feed containers, tools lying around. It's not a place where children normally sit for long periods, especially at night. But he went in there and stayed. When someone checked on him, they found him sitting quietly, and he was drinking snake venom. Not accidentally. Not because he didn't know what it was. He was deliberately consuming it. People panicked. They rushed to him. grabbed the container, tried to stop him, shouting his name, demanding to know what he was doing. He didn't resist strongly. He didn't fight them. He just looked confused, almost detached, like he didn't fully understand why they were so upset. The venom didn't kill him. Snake venom doesn't always work the way people think it does, especially if ingested rather than injected through a bite. But that doesn't make the act any less disturbing. The intent alone was terrifying. A child, barely returned from a traumatic disappearance, calmly drinking something known to be deadly. When asked why he did it, he didn't give a clear answer. Some say he said nothing at all. Others say he muttered something about needing to do it. Others claim he said it was the only way. But no one can agree on his exact words because his state of mind was so fractured at that point. What everyone agrees on is this: he was not himself anymore. From that point forward, he was watched constantly. He was never left alone again for a long time. The family sought help in the ways available to them at the time, but resources were limited, especially in rural areas. People didn't talk about mental health the way they do now. Trauma wasn't well understood. Strange behavior was often explained away, prayed over, or simply endured. Over time, he stabilized. He grew up. He became a farmer. He lived a life that, from the outside, looked normal enough. He worked the land. He raised animals. He participated in family life. But those who knew him well said he was never quite the same after those 3 days in the woods. He avoided forests whenever possible. He didn't like full moon nights. He had moments where he would withdraw, becoming quiet and distant for reasons no one could understand. Sometimes he would wake from sleep in a panic. Sometimes he would sit outside at night, staring into the darkness as if listening for something only he could hear. And he never, ever talked about what happened in the woods. Not once. That silence is what keeps the story alive. If it had just been a child getting lost and coming back traumatized, people might have eventually stopped telling it. Trauma, sadly, is something families learn to live with. But the timing, the full moon, the sudden return, the extreme behavior afterward, and especially the act of drinking snake venom, all combine into something that feels unfinished. Some people in the family believe he encountered something in the woods. Others believe his mind broke under the stress, and the rest is just people trying to make sense of a psychological collapse using folklore and fear. In some places, woods are not just woods. They are places tied to old beliefs, old warnings, stories passed down quietly about what happens when you wander too far alone. There are whispers about him seeing something he wasn't meant to see. There are whispers about him being threatened, followed, or tested by something under the full moon. There are whispers that the venom was an attempt to protect himself, or to stop something from following him back. No one knows the truth. What makes the story so disturbing isn't just what happened, but how little explanation there ever was. There was no moment of clarity, no confession, no breakthrough, just a child who disappeared, returned broken, and carried that break quietly for the rest of his life. Even now, when the story is told, people pause at the same parts. The third night, the full moon, the way he looked when he came back, the chicken room, the venom. Those details never fade. It's easy to dismiss it all as trauma. And maybe that's exactly what it was. Trauma can do terrifying things to a mind, especially a young one. It can create behaviors that seem irrational, dangerous, and inexplicable to those who haven't experienced it. But there's also something unsettling about how cleanly the events line up, how suddenly he returned, how extreme his behavior was immediately afterward, how deeply whatever happened seemed to root itself inside him. Some stories don't offer answers. They just sit in families like this one, passed from one generation to the next. Not as warnings or lessons, but as reminders that there are experiences people go through that never fully translate into words. Experiences that change someone forever, even if they survive. And sometimes, survival itself is the strangest part of all. My friends and I were driving around one afternoon with no real plan, just killing time the way people do when they're young and restless. We weren't looking for anything specific, but we ended up taking a road none of us recognized, and that's when we saw it. Off to the side, partially hidden by overgrown trees and tall grass, was an old, abandoned farm. It immediately caught our attention. The place looked like it had been forgotten for decades. The house was slumped and weather-worn, the paint long gone, the windows dark and empty. Near it was a barn that leaned just slightly, not enough to collapse, but enough to look unstable. What really drew us in, though, was the swing set. It was old, rusted, and crooked, standing alone like someone had just walked away from it and never come back. It looked eerie in a way that felt perfect for photos. We decided to stop. We parked the car on the side of the road and got out, joking nervously but excited. It felt harmless at first, just an abandoned place, just pictures. The farm sat on a small hill, so we had to walk uphill to get closer. The grass was uneven, the ground soft in places, but we didn't think much of it. As we walked up, we noticed a massive hole in the ground. It wasn't a small dip or a shallow pit. It was deep, wide, and dark, like the earth had simply opened up. We glanced at it, commented on how strange it was, then casually walked around it. No one suggested leaving. No one felt alarmed yet. We just kept going, focused on the swing set and the photos we wanted. We started taking pictures. The light was good. The place looked haunting in an almost beautiful way. My friend got on the swing, and we took turns snapping photos. She slowly walked closer toward the barn, probably trying to get a better angle, or maybe just curious. That's when everything changed for me. Out of nowhere, I was hit with this overwhelming feeling. It wasn't fear exactly. It felt more like the early moments of an anxiety attack. That sudden, sinking sensation in your chest, the tightness in your throat, the feeling that something is very wrong even if you can't explain why. My heart started racing. My hands felt cold. I've always been sensitive to spirits and energy, and this felt like a warning, loud and unmistakable. Something was wrong. I turned around, about to tell my friends that we needed to leave, that we needed to get out of there right now. Before I could say a word, I heard it, a man's voice. "Hey!" It came from the direction of the barn. It wasn't distant. It wasn't muffled. It was loud, sharp, and close enough that it felt like it was meant specifically for us. There was no confusion about whether we'd imagined it. We all heard it. We didn't wait to see who it was. The three of us bolted. We ran down the hill as fast as we could, adrenaline kicking in instantly. My mind went blank except for one thought: get away. As we ran, I completely forgot about the hole. I didn't even see it. I just felt the ground disappear beneath me. I went in head first. The fall knocked the air out of me. Dirt and darkness swallowed my vision for a second, and panic hit even harder. My friends stopped immediately, grabbing my arms and pulling me up with frantic strength. As they dragged me out, I looked up, and that's when I saw him. An old man was standing at the edge of the hole. He was just there, staring down at me. I can still see his outline in my mind. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. He just stood there watching, like he had been waiting. I don't remember him saying anything. I don't remember him moving. I just remember his presence, solid and unmistakable. I screamed. It wasn't a controlled scream. It came out of me raw and terrified. My friends didn't question it. They yanked me the rest of the way out and dragged me toward the car. We didn't stop running until we were inside with the doors slammed shut. As we sped away, my heart was pounding so hard, I felt dizzy. I turned around in my seat and looked back toward the farm, toward the hill, toward the hole. There was no one there. No old man, no movement, nothing. The farm looked empty again, silent and still, like it had before we ever arrived. My friends started asking if I was okay, asking if I was hurt. They were confused about why I had screamed so badly when they pulled me up. When I finally caught my breath, I asked them the question that mattered most to me. Did you see the man? They looked at each other, then back at me. They told me they heard the voice yell, "Hey," just like I did. That part was real for all of us. But they said they never saw anyone. Not near the barn, not near the hole, not anywhere. Apparently, it was just me. That realization chilled me more than the fall itself. I know what I saw. It wasn't vague. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of light. It was a person, standing there, close enough to look down at me, and yet to everyone else, there was nothing. We never went back. Not to get more photos, not to investigate, not to prove anything. Whatever that place was, whatever happening there, it made itself known enough to drive us away, and none of us felt the need to test it again. Even now, thinking about it makes my chest tighten. The feeling I had before the voice, the timing of the fall, the way the man appeared only when I was at my most vulnerable, and then vanished without a trace. It all felt too intentional to dismiss easily. Some places don't want to be visited, and sometimes they make sure you know it. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.